Welcome to round 5. So after that extremely important win in the previous round, I was now a full point ahead of the field. But this game was not going to be any easier. This was the second day of the third day of play. And after playing the number 1 in the previous round, I was now going to play the second strongest player in the country, International Master Anquandah, and the reigning national champion at the time. But I mean, fortunately, this time I was with the white pieces, so I was a bit more confident in my prep. I started with d4, played knight f6, c4, and then e5. And he does this sometimes. It's not the best opening, not the most sound, but it can be a bit tricky. It's called a Budapest, and I mean certain players play it very well, but yeah, it's not the soundest for black. And the thing is, he does this quite often. He plays this fairly often with black, and so I was actually quite well prepared in this, and I decided to go for a line where you take knight g4 and you go e4. And this line was popularized, I think, by some world champion long ago. And the knight takes on e5, which is natural, because after e4 you are hitting the knight, and then you play f4. I mean, and the thing about the what I prepped was, I mean, you play like an absolute buffoon for a few moves, but you get a kind of position that black could very easily get into a lot of trouble if they're not careful. So knight comes to e6, knight c3, and you're threatening to just develop everything, maybe castle queen side with your knight here, and then just argue that you have all the space in the center. And so bishop c5 is a very natural response. And here the move at prep was to continue knight a4, and again, this breaks like all the rules of the opening, right? You shouldn't move a piece twice. You shouldn't move all your pawns like that without developing your actual pieces. So it just looks kind of silly. But this was all part of the prep, and yeah, there were some lines that continued. I think the best line continued with bishop b4, and I kid you not, I think the best move there was something like king f2. It was some crazy things. But here he played bishop takes g1, and when you look at it, it does look like I just dropped the pawn, because after rook takes queen h4 and he checks my king, and my h2 pawn is hanging, and it looks like it will hang with tempo on my rook. So it looks like I just blundered. And granted, the part of why it looks so natural is that the moves I've made look silly, right? Because of all these moves, it's very easy for you to think that this really is just a tactic, because I mean these moves look like they can't be good. But this was all actually part of the prep. And after g3, queen takes on h2. Believe it or not, the position is +2 for white, and black is almost lost. And I knew this, which was very comforting. But it's not that simple. So the problem is that black's queen has ventured a bit too far, and it's going to have a hard time going back to its own part of the board safely. And by the time he manages to do this, all my pieces will have come out. So I'll develop with a lot of tempo on this queen, and he will find himself with a very serious disadvantage in development in exchange for that pawn. So here the prep that I later looked was that I should continue with rook g2. I have no idea why it's better. Probably the rook does something later on. But I played bishop e3, which looks a bit more natural. I develop and also defend the rook, and I want to just complete development in castle and argue that he's not well developed. Now he plays d6, and he wants to bring some of his pieces out. But you can see the first problem, right? That this knight these knights are a bit superfluous. So they both want to be on this one square. So you'd really rather have one knight here. But the knight that started here has been chased all the way there. And so this knight now on b8 is a bit short of squares. And after d6, he clearly wants to bring out this bishop, right? So I start with queen b3. And my idea is I'm just going to always keep an eye on b7 and make it difficult for you to ever develop that bishop, because I do need to develop my queen. I want to develop my queen, and I want to castle queen side, and then I can drop my bishop, connect my rooks, and start chasing the queen around. So I thought the best square for the queen would be here on b3 to do the double job of also looking at this pawn on b7. So now he started going back with this queen. Queen goes to h5, patrols this diagonal, stops me from castling. But then I develop with tempo. So this is part of the problem, that no matter where you go with your queen, I always get a ton of tempo on that queen. So bishop e2 comes with tempo. The queen drops back to g6, hits this pawn. And here I played f5, hitting the queen. Apparently knight c3 is much better, close to winning actually. And I guess the problem is after eventual f5, the queen is going to have to drop here, and at that point, a knight's coming to d5 would just be game over. Probably some ideas of getting a knight step, because I mean the knight on a4 is the only piece of mine that isn't actually doing much. But I started with f5 media, which is still very good. I mean, still like plus 2, and the queen did drop back to f6, and I castled long, and you start to see the problem. So although black came in for this pawn, I've completed development, I've castled, and yeah, he still has this mess to deal with. He can castle, but even castling doesn't seem to be very good. He's just going to walk into this pawn storm over here on the king side. So his position is actually in a bit of trouble, and now he needs to decide how to untangle these pieces. Because of this pawn on f5, the light square bishop only has one square, and that's also the only logical square for the knight. So he has to. The first problem is, what do you do with your knights? Yeah, I don't think you really ever want to play knight a6. It doesn't look too bad actually, but yeah, it doesn't look too good either. It doesn't do anything. So the solution he came up with was to play knight a5, and I'd kind of seen this idea as well. Gaining tempo on my queen, with the point being that after I go queen b5 check, which is what I went, he's going to put another knight now on c6. Which is good in that at least it allows him to develop all his pieces and potentially castle. But of course, the disadvantage is that this knight is going to be stuck here for a while, and he always has to look out for ideas of me playing like b4. Currently they don't work because he has this a6. I think that's trapped my queen in a lot of lines. So that's a move I had to always look out for. So I mean, if I try it now, then just a6, I think, and my queen has to move somewhere, and then the pawn falls. So I played c5, and the problem is if I do anything also, say if I want to go maybe g4 g5, he still has that move a6, and the knights actually do a good job of giving me, I mean, taking squares away from my queen, right? So my queen would have literally just one square here on d5, and is there any tactic from there? Yeah, and then so if I have to go there, then knight b4 comes, right? And that starts to get a bit annoying. So I had to create a square for my queen in anticipation of this a6 move, and that's part of the reason why I went for this early c5. It also kind of gets my knight doing something, and he can't really take because I think I'll just take with the bishop, and he can't castle now. That looks just really bad. I could also just take with a knight, get the knight doing something. That also looks horrible. So he definitely can't take that pawn. And now a6 doesn't really do anything because my queen has this diagonal to run away on. And I'm threatening to take now and then create a huge target here on d6. So he castles out of the way. King side, it does look like the king has to run away now. And I take on d6, the pawn takes back. And in addition to having this huge advantage development, now I have a very big weakness on d6 to attack. And yeah, the game is starting to look very nice indeed. So now my knight comes back to c3. It's eyeing this very juicy outpost on the d5 square, and he goes b6. So now he has to do something. He has to figure out how to develop the rest of his pieces. b6 is a move that holds down this knight on a5 and allows him to develop this bishop to b7 and maybe bring his rooks over here to the c file. And I continue with g4. So now that he's castled kingside, I'm just threatening to play g4 g5, get the queen out of there, maybe go for g6, maybe f6, depends on how he responds. But yeah, I just want to open up this king and attack it with all my pieces. So I'm sort of attacking on both sides of the board because I am still attacking in the center, looking at this square, looking at this square. And I mean, he has basically zero play. It's extremely tough, and you can easily see how the position is lost. And so he goes queen e7, just stepping out of g5. Yeah, that doesn't change anything. I just go g5 anyways. And yeah, he has to do something. He has to do something right now because I'm threatening to push f6 with tempo on the queen, and that would just open up his king, and that would be completely lost. So he starts with a6, which looks like the only thing he can really try to create some play. So he gets one tempo on my queen. I don't think I'm brave enough to take this because of rook b8. It seems extremely unnecessary. And so I played queen d3, right? This is the natural thing. And then he went knight b4, getting more tempo on my queen. But this is the thing, I'm attacking this pawn on d6 twice, and I just take the pawn. And here I'm thinking, well, I've won my pawn back now. I'm not down any material at all, and I'm winning both on the king side and in the center. So he has to do something, and he has to do something right now. And there is only one sequence of moves that makes the game even interesting. I mean, that leaves any kind of tension still. And he finds exactly that, and he had to find it exactly right now. And he did. And that's the reason I named this video what I did. I mean, you know, sometimes players are just extremely strong, and yeah, you know, sometimes when you don't win or you lose, it's not really your fault. Many times it is, but sometimes it's not really your fault. And the move he played here is knight takes on a2, and it looks absolutely ridiculous, but it's absolutely necessary, and it's like the only try that that leads, because like the position is so completely lost. I mean, just like this pawn is hanging, these pieces look silly. The queen is unpre, so he probably has to trade queens now. Then the b6 pawn will be a problem. If he has to push it, my bishop will get this diagonal. All my pieces look great. I'm still probably going to play either g6 or f6 to open up his king. And I mean, he has just absolutely nothing. His pieces all look very, very, very silly. Still yet to complete development. So, you know, any normal move you make basically loses on the spot. And he found just the one idea that exists in a position to create any kind of play at all. And the point is, after knight takes a2, knight takes a2, he's giving up a piece. He takes a second pawn for the piece. He takes on e4. And during the game, I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, yeah, but you give up a piece. So I mean, if you're not like mating me or anything, that has to be just completely lost. And I mean, it is still lost. But now for me to win, I would have to be extremely accurate. The position still does have some venom, of course. My king has basically no squares. This is the only square available, and the threat is for him to play knight b3, which would be checkmate because all the squares around my king would be covered. And so my next move was forced. The queen also attacks my bishop at the same time, so I have only one move, which is queen d3, to come defend my bishop and block this diagonal. And then he takes a third pawn with bishop takes f5. So now he's given up a piece for 3 pawns, so he kind of has compensation, but it's only kind of. And yeah, usually a piece will tend to beat out the pawns in an endgame, but it depends on which piece it is and how the pawns are distributed. And that is maybe what I should have been more attuned to during the game. But anyway, so I traded queens, and the diagonal is still defended, so knight b3 still would be checkmate. And so the next move is also fairly forced, which is bishop d3. I still have to block that diagonal, and so we traded bishops as well, and he went knight c4. So now he's shown his hand. He's ready to play this endgame down a piece for 3 pawns, and he claims that he can find some compensation. And he's right and he's wrong. He's wrong in that the position is still completely lost for black, and the way to win is that you have to keep the bishop. So the knights don't do so well against pawns, especially against passed pawns, but bishops are fairly, I mean, they mop up pawns much easier. And so in this endgame, I should have been more protective of this bishop and not allowed him to trade the bishop off easily. But I didn't. So I made a mistake. What I did, I played b3, hits the knight. I didn't like this knight on c4. He was going to play b5, and I didn't want any of that. So I allowed this trade of knight for bishop, and now the position is equal. It's just an equal endgame, and then the reason is because the knight will have trouble dealing with passed pawns on both sides of the board, and like you are going to see, the knight really didn't play much of a role in the endgame that came up. So yeah, he played f5, starting to threaten to roll down the board with his pawns. I took him passant. The rook took back, rook e7, trying to coordinate my pieces to attack something. So g6 is fairly forced, and I played rook d1, threatening to double here on the 7th rank. The rook came to f8, I doubled. The rook came to f7, all fairly forced. And then I started to bring my knight into the game. So he traded one pair of rooks on e7, then h5. The pawn started rolling down the board. My king has to join the action. b5. Both sides of the board are now rolling. King e3, g5. And here you can see the problem that my knight doesn't do much, right? If my knight were somewhere either restricting these pawns from moving forward or threatening to take some of these weak pawns, I could have still been winning, but the knight doesn't do quite enough to carry itself in this position, and so it's not worth these 3 extra pawns, right? This is what he's trying to argue, and he's doing quite successfully. And so I have to try and neutralize the pawns now. So the rook comes back to e5, and from afar, I thought this was not. I thought he shouldn't go g5 because of this move, because now he has to. I mean, whichever one of the pawns he moves, I take the other one, right? And so I felt a move like rook g3 would be forced, and then I thought just knight here, I guess, and I just win the pawn. If I win even one of these pawns, it all of a sudden becomes very, very difficult for him to hold, because the other one will fall much easier, and these guys are not nowhere near as threatening. So I thought, yeah, okay, this position kind of looks nice. I mean, it's probably still drawn, but I thought this at least looked pleasant. And then he played g4. And so here he had seen this little trick that I had missed. And it's a very clever move. And the point is, I mean, I pretty much have to take the h pawn, right? But he goes b4 now. And this is where, sometimes experience and class comes in. He understands what's going on. And I hadn't seen this trick ahead of time, because the knight has to move, and after knight d5, he just goes rook f3, and he takes up the 3rd pawn. And the reason why it's so clever is because he can't lose now. So once he takes my last pawn, the worst case scenario, the game is a draw. And the reason is that even if he blunders all of his pawns, rook and knight versus just rook is a draw. So my best case scenario is a drawn ending. So I would have had to keep at least one of my pawns alive to try and win the endgame. But now I absolutely cannot win. So the rest of the game was me slowly realizing that the game was no longer winnable. And after a bit of shuffling and pretending like we were still playing the game, I realized that I can go after the pawns, and maybe I win them eventually. But again, even at the end of that tunnel, there is no win. So I took on b4, and the game ended on the spot. After takes, it's just a draw. So yeah, this was my first half point dropped in the tournament. But like I said, after looking through the game, I wasn't even very mad, because I really just made one half mistake, which was here after he went for this exchange of the piece for 2 pawns, where I played b3 and allowed him to take my bishop. I should have kept the bishop with like a bishop d4 and played the endgame with the bishop rather than just the knight against the 3 pawns. But that was it. I mean, and that should not be enough for you to not win a game. I get like my prep on the board, which leads to a winning position out of the opening. That's +3 out of the opening, and I know it's winning. And I don't make any serious mistakes in converting, but he still manages to hold you down to a drawn ending. I mean, at some point you just have to tip your cap and acknowledge that someone played an extremely good game of chess. And yeah, these strong players, they really are like that. They don't just go down easily, Even when you do everything right, sometimes it's not good enough. So yeah, this was round 5, but I was still 4.5 out of 5, still having a very good tournament. Mr. Hasford won his game this round, I believe, and so after this round, he was just half a point behind me, so I couldn't afford to lose. Which made the next game all the more interesting, because after playing number 1 and then number 2, of course, I was going to play number 3, and the third strongest player in the country in the next game, which I can't wait to bring you. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment, drop a like. Happy chessing, and I'll see you later.